We begin with defiance and determination from Ukraine's president, who has been speaking to CNN at a major global conference. In an interview with our senior international correspondent, Frederick Pleitgen, Volodymyr Zelensky called on the West to hurry up with its deliveries of new weapons to help turn the tide, he said, in Ukraine's war with Russia. Listen to what he told the delegates at the Delphi Economic Forum just in the past few hours.
We are at war and the enemy is serious, but let's be realists and not pessimists. Let's be realists. Now the situation is stabilized. Once we have weapons and concrete political steps from our partners, we will break Putin's backbone.
Well, Fred joins us now from that forum in Greece. I mean, look, this is not a new message from the Ukrainian president. In fact, if you think about it, we've been hearing this message since almost the beginning of this war back in February of 2022. Just how urgent is that message now, Fred?
I think that's exactly the key issue right now. It certainly isn't a new message, but it is definitely a very urgent message, especially the way things are going on the battlefield right now for the Ukrainians, where we just heard there from the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, when I asked him how things actually were going, that things have stabilized, but of course we know that the Russians have been pressing, and that right now things also are very dangerous for the Ukrainians, Becky, as the Russians are bringing more firepower, also air power, to bear on Ukrainian troops. In fact, one of the things that he said during that session that we had with him was he kept talking about needing more air defense systems to try and keep the cities safe, but of course also to keep Ukrainian frontline troops from getting the brunt of those massive Russian air attacks. Now, on the whole, Volodymyr Zelensky said that he still does believe that the Ukrainians would be able to turn the tide and will be able to turn the tide, but they need more weapons from the U.S. and its allies, and certainly more ammunition, and they need them very fast. Here's what he said.
I understand that this is not easy and everybody is thinking about oneself, and we are grateful to all our partners. But what we have now is not sufficient. If we want to truly prevail over Putin, if nobody wants Putin to drag the world into Third World War.
Thank you, Mr. President. As you know, there was a report out this week that allegedly, and it's still a very big if, Donald Trump is elected president of the United States in November, that he would essentially force Ukraine into call it a peace deal with Russia that would force Ukraine to cede territory, like, for instance, giving up on getting back Crimea and also ceding the Donbas region. Would you ever be willing to give up Ukrainian territory for peace?
First and foremost, those signals were on certain media platforms. I haven't heard that directly from Trump. His ideas in detail, I did not have an opportunity to discuss them with him and to discuss his ideas on how to end the war. If I have such opportunity, I will, with pleasure, listen to them, and then we can discuss the topic.
So there you have the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, pretty careful then speaking about what could happen if if Donald Trump becomes the U.S. president again. Of course, right now there still is a whole process in the U.S., Becky, that ends with the election in November. But you do feel with the Ukrainian president that there is that renewed sense of urgency right now as the Russians are pressing. But I did find him to still be very combative, and he was saying that Ukraine, of course, will not cede any of its territory voluntarily, Becky.
It's good to have you, Fred. Thank you very much indeed.
So we're joined by Ukraine's former defense minister, Andriy Zagorodnyk. Sir, it's good to have you with us this morning. We heard from President, good afternoon, rather, where you are, sir. We heard from President Zelensky this morning, as I just noted. He said it's important to be not be pessimistic, but to be realistic. He also said, when asked by our Frederick Pleitgen about the lack of U.S. military aid, he painted a somewhat more optimistic picture while still stressing the need for, of course, additional arms. How would you assess the state of the war in this moment?
We need to understand that Russians, of course, they're pushing extremely heavy, and they are basically sparing no expenses to, to try to advance at least somewhere, and they are moving in some directions with a very incremental, very small pace. Like we're talking about kilometers, sometimes hundreds of meters. At the same time, losing a tremendous amount of people on the way. At the same time, they're still keeping the group of forces around 300,000 there, and they're of course a substantial force, and they have what we call a fire advantage over Ukraine, meaning that they have more ammunition, more guns, and so on. So what is currently going on is that, of course, Ukraine have managed to stabilize most of the parts of the front line. So Russians certainly don't have a chance to move substantially deep into the territory of Ukraine. But that stability is extremely fragile and full of the combat engagements, tens of combat engagements in different parts of the front a day. When President was talking about not to be pessimistic, is because we see that Western observers often they assess this soberly, the situation, and they try to raise the awareness around the world about the very difficult situation, and they're bringing this to the news, to the analytical reports, and so on. And then many of them going a bit further and then saying, well, then there is no chance, and that's certainly not the case. Ukraine still can win. Ukraine still can stop Russia. Ukraine still can actually even counter-offend in a not so distant future. It's just a matter of having enough capabilities, having enough arms and ammunition. And we need to be very careful about that line of being realistic and not going into the kind of despair and trying to say, okay, then there is like no victory in sight. That's absolutely not the case. There is a good chances for victory still.
As you know, some $60 billion in potential funding is essentially stalled here in the United States, blocked in the House. The UK Foreign Secretary David Cameron has been in the US meeting with officials, pushing for more aid for Ukraine. Do you believe that will happen, that the US will in fact be able to perhaps pass additional aid?
U.S. can pass it at any day whenever there's a political decision. So far, whatever we have a problem with is basically no political decision. There is a very clear one party decides that at the moment it's in their interest to stop that aid, and we believe that's a wrong political decision because it costs an enormous amount of efforts and human lives and so on. Particularly when we're talking about the air defense, where Russians are trying to use that to their advantage, both against civilian targets and against military targets. And it's very difficult from here, from Ukraine, to predict what's going to happen in DC within that one party. But we do hope that there will be some common sense finally, and they will unblock the aid. At the same time, in Europe, there's a lot of discussions right now about the fact that the world and Europe needs to live without U.S. leadership in the process of the global security, because lots of people are really concerned with the fact that internal matters are blocking U.S. from deciding something which has massive global importance.
There are also questions about what could happen, of course, come November, who will be in the White House and the impact that could have on future relations and, of course, future aid to Ukraine. My colleague Fred Pleitgen asked President Zelensky earlier today about this idea that has reportedly been floated by Donald Trump, who believes that he could bring about peace very quickly in the war, but that may entail ceding the Donbass region and not regaining control of Crimea. So Fred asked President Zelensky how he felt about that plan. He was very diplomatic in his answer, saying he would be willing to talk with the former president, who had not presented those ideas to Zelensky. Do you believe that is something President Zelensky would in fact consider?
Certainly, he will talk to a president of the United States, that's for sure. Secondly, we need to understand that what being transmitted about the Trump's position is through the second hand, so to speak. So it's not like he himself formally announced it publicly, because that's a terrible idea. The idea of ceding territories in exchange for peace is completely utopian, and it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And I sincerely hope that Republican Party, whoever is advising President Trump, will advise him not to say that and not to do that, because that just doesn't make sense. If you give more land to Putin, he will want more. He will not want less. I mean, it just goes against the common sense in the way how Russians are operating and what exactly their strategy is. Their strategy is to gain as much land as possible. And if you give them some, they will just go for more, because they will say, you see, it's working out, we're getting further, let's do it. And then if to give them, even theoretically, which is, by the way, legally is also impossible, but if theoretically to provide them, to give them something like concessions, in exchange for peace, they will take concessions straight away, but the peace will be fragile and most likely will not hold even for a short period of time, because they will break that deal as well as they broke all other deals before. So that's just like, it will not work.
Andrei Zagorodnik, really appreciate your insight and your expertise.
Thank you.
Thank you.